Spiritual whoredom. What is it? We're going to figure out on this next segment on Fourth Day.
Let there be light. Let there be light.
So what is spiritual whoredom? We hear it a lot in Christian sects, and many in the church will be familiar with the term found in the book of Revelation as the whore of Babylon. But what is spiritual whoredom? We have to find out by going back to the root of the problem, as we can see in Numbers chapter 15, when this first came about, this term first came about. In the book of Numbers chapter 15, you're going to start to see that God is trying to establish a difference between the judgment of one who sins against him through ignorance and not understanding what he was doing. He didn't mean to do it. And somebody that lifts his hand in highness against him and says, no, I'm not going to do what you say. Even though I understand what's being said, I'm not going to do it. Okay, so take a look at this excerpt from Numbers chapter 15 first so we can get a background of what God calls spiritual whoredom.
Verse 29, you shall have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel, but for the stranger that sojourneth among them. But the soul that does aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth Jehovah. And that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of Jehovah, and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall be utterly cut off, and his iniquity shall be upon him.
So again, as I mentioned before in other videos, it does not matter whether or not you are homeborn or you are from other nations. All those that choose the God of Israel have to choose him and attach them to his law. God always just says that I want a hearing ear and to listen to him, because if we are not doing his commandments, then he is not our God and we are not his people. So make no mistake, it does not matter if you can call yourself a homeborn one of Israel or Jew or whatnot. You can look at Isaiah chapter 56 and see that same principle being displayed, that the foreigner that joins himself unto Jehovah and keeps his Sabbaths, even him will he bring to his holy mountain. So let me get that out first and foremost. But on to the point. So we can see here that God is making a difference between the person that is sinning through ignorance and the one that's just sinning with a high hand saying, no, I'm going to rebel. It's very different. I mean, you would do the same thing if you were in any authority position. You would say, hey, you didn't mean to do it. You deal with him a little bit differently versus somebody that just says, no, I'm not going to do as you say. That's rebellion. Okay, so that's a lot different. So what does God use as an example to teach this precept? Well, you can see if you continue in Numbers chapter 15, you'll see what happens. There's a man that goes and gathers his sticks on the Sabbath day. It was just same thing as every other day that he would normally do. He was just doing his daily tasks. And Moses says, well, what do I need to do with this person? You know, this guy knew what he was doing. And so Moses comes back and God says, hey, the punishment is death. He was trying to make a public example of this man saying, hey, you're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath and you're not supposed to be gathering those sticks. I told you to rest on the Sabbath, that it's a day holy unto me, and that it's a sign between you and I, that all those that choose me as their God, God is saying, is you have to be taking upon the covenant, and that is of keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath day must be holy, as the fourth commandment of the covenant states. Where does the idea of spiritual whoredom come into play? Take a look, it's coming up right now.
And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make fringes in the borders of their garment throughout their generations, and they may put upon the fringe of their borders a ribbon of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of Jehovah, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am Jehovah your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Jehovah your God.
Okay, so as I mentioned also in other videos before, the reason why I wear what is commonly known in Jewish circles today as tzitzit, or a blue ribbon, a fringe that you put on the four corners of your garment, it is meant right here in this passage we just read that God says to wear it, and in the old days you would wear it upon a four-cornered garment, which we don't have today, so it looks a little funky when you wear it, but the whole point of that was God was saying, look, I'm trying to establish a difference between someone that is sinning ignorantly, they didn't know any better, and somebody that does it out of a rebellious spirit. So what I want you to do is I want you to take these, put them on the four corners of your garments, right? So that you would see it, and it would always be a conscious visual reminder that you should do my commandments and do my statutes and not just go and do whatever you feel like is right. So there's a difference between someone that is righteous, somebody that is kind, somebody that is a moral person, and somebody that is holy. What God is looking for in this nation is a group of people that he can call his own. Okay, that's what holiness is. So if we're not going to be a people that are going to hearken and listen unto the statutes and the Sabbaths and the festivals and things that he gave us to follow, then he doesn't have a people unto himself anymore. That's why this is such a difficult road for people to comprehend, because they've heard so many other doctrines that say to depart from the laws. And so what we've done is we've done exactly what God is showing here, is that we are sinning ignorantly. But after this video, I want this to be very clear what the path is you should take and what spiritual whoredom is. So God refers to spiritual whoredom right there in this video. For the first time in the Bible, it says you have gone whoring after your gods. But why does he say that? You have to understand that this is a marriage covenant. God always refers to Israel as his wife, as his bride. I'm married unto you. So if we are not listening to our husband, so to speak, then we're going whoring after other gods. And it doesn't even matter whether or not we're worshiping another god by another name or not. If we're not listening to his commandments that we're supposed to do that keep us holy and separate unto him and faithful unto him, then this is what spiritual whoredom is. That's what God calls it. Spiritual whoredom stems from the idea that one can do whatever one wants, regardless of what God says, and still call him your God. That is unfaithfulness. That is also known as spiritual whoredom. So God says to keep his commandments, keep his statutes, that you be holy unto him, and not go a whoring by not keeping his commandments.
Mary, I am out of control. Whatever, I do what I want.
So again, just remember, that's a very important thing, that if we choose him as our God, then we accept his laws and his instructions that he gave us. Nobody else in other cultures who have chosen another foreign god would ever listen to another nation's God's instructions. It works both ways. The God of Israel says, here's my laws, here's my statutes, do them. And the gods of all the other nations say, here's the laws of their gods, you do them, you practice them. It's no different. So for us to turn our ears away from that would be what is spiritual whoredom. And we're going to take a look at a couple other examples and see where this stems from and how it's prevalent today.
Jeremiah 7:23, but this thing I commanded them, saying, Hearken unto my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And walk ye in all the way that I command you, that it may be well with you. But they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear, but walked in their own counsels, and in their stubbornness of their evil heart, and went backward and not forward.
So you can remember this phrase as whoring, or going after somebody else's eyes, and the church will recognize this phrase as the great whore of Babylon. But where does it really stem from? If you want to find out who is spiritually gone a whoring, all you have to do is look and find out if they are keeping God's commandments, statutes, and laws and Sabbaths. That's all you have to do. Some forsake these due to ignorance because of the leaders that are teaching them to go away. But at the end of the day, spiritual whoredom is spiritual whoredom. We cannot be just like the people in 2 Kings chapter 17 where they claimed the God of Israel, but they did whatever they wanted to do. And it even says in verse 34 and 35, if you continue to look on in 2 Kings chapter 17, it says they do it unto this day, which means God sent the prophets to tell them to continue in the laws, continue in the statutes and the principles, continue obeying, but they wouldn't do it. They kept claiming the God of Israel, but they would worship other gods, or they would claim him and just not do what he said to do. This is spiritual whoredom. So, sinning through ignorance and sinning with a high hand is totally different. We can remember this also being referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 29 when God says this.
And it shall come to pass, when he hears the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, though I walk in the imagination of mine heart, to add drunkenness to thirst. Jehovah will not spare him, but the anger of Jehovah and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him. And Jehovah shall blot out his name from under heaven. And Jehovah shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to the curses of the covenant that are written in the book of the law.
So you'll probably recognize this excerpt from Deuteronomy 29 as something I refer to as the mystery of Judas. If you remember and recall, Jesus always responded about the man that betrays his fellow countrymen, or the man that betrays his other fellow brethren, as that he should have never ever been born. And if you've been watching these videos, you'll understand that what it means to be born again means that you desire not to sin anymore. And what is sin? Sin is a transgression of the laws of God. It is something that misses the mark that God has placed before you to try to hit. So he says, here's the laws, here's the commandments, and if you veer away from that, then that is sin, whether it's through ignorance or whether it's done by a spirit of rebellion intentionally. It's sin, but it's dealt with differently. Okay, so I want to make sure that people understand that sin is dealt with differently depending on whether or not it's done intentionally or through ignorance. But God is stating here that you are a traitor of your people, so to speak, just like the traitorous Jews were in the book of the Maccabees that had no regard for the law, and they tried to hide their circumcisions, as you'll see in the book of the Maccabees did. And the writers of the book of the Maccabees called those Jews traitorous Jews. That is exactly what is being spoken of in Deuteronomy 29. The person that says, hey, I'm going to take the oath, I'm going to call the God of Israel my own, I'm going to take upon this covenant, but then he says, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I feel like I want to do, because God's laws and God's covenants don't matter to me. God says, I'm not willing to forgive you for that. If you want to go and do whatever you want to do, then all the curses that you just read in Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 28 that are part of this covenant for those that are disobedient to it, I'm going to throw all these curses upon you. So be very careful when you take upon the covenant that you continue forward and continue to grow and keep these statutes, keep these commandments, because he says he'll block you out of the book of life that he keeps for those that he'll bring back to the land. So the goal is always to obtain righteousness through God's laws and his statutes that he gave us, so that one day we would go back to the land and live in Israel, the land that he promised our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the goal. It's not about going to heaven. It's about living in the land of Israel so that we can be a beacon of truth and be an example of righteousness to bring glory to the creator of the universe. That's why he created Israel. And if we're not doing these commandments, then we are spiritually whoring away. We are not being a faithful wife to the creator of Israel as it's proclaimed to be. And we can see examples of this that God brought up. First and foremost, if you look at Leviticus chapter 20, when God was bringing the people out of the land and bringing them into the land where the Canaanites and the Jebusites and things like that were, you can see that the people were worshiping other gods. One of the other gods that they used to worship and they used to sacrifice to was a god by the name of Moloch, which we know that it's not a real god, but what they would do is they would actually sacrifice and give their children. The Canaanites would give their children to this false god. And what God was trying to tell the people in Leviticus chapter 20 is that, look, don't go whoring after this other god. Don't go start doing what the Canaanites used to do, because I want you to be holy unto me. I want you to be different from all these other nations. So the things that I'm giving you, they're going to be different than those that you see all around you. And this was always the snare that Israel had, in that they were surrounded by all these countries that had other, statutes, other festivals, other things that they went by. And God says, no, don't do those things, because I want you to be a people unto me. And if you won't do that, then you're gone a whoring. You're not being faithful unto me. And this idea of child sacrifice and human sacrifice continued because of the rights of the neighboring countries around Israel. They started to pick up things that the other countries were doing, and this is exactly what Deuteronomy 12 says not to do. Don't learn the ways of the heathen. Don't learn the ways of the other nations and try to mimic them, because what I'm giving you is for you to be practiced so that you'd be different from everybody else. That's what holiness is. It's not a mystical idea. It's just an idea that you are separated from the other nations to be a holy nation unto him. Because you have to keep in mind that this is a nation of people. If you are wanting to keep this covenant, then you will be a holy nation, as God gave us the covenant in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 and 6. It says, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you'll be a peculiar people. You'll be a separated people unto me. All the earth is mine. So keep that in mind. The goal is not heaven, okay? The goal is to go and live in the land of Israel, to be a example to all the other nations and proclaim that there's one God and it's him, and we're the witnesses of it. So if we're not going to keep these laws and do them, then we're gone spiritually whoring. So Micah chapter 6 expounds on this topic of gone and whoring after other gods and giving their children as a sacrifice. And God says, I don't want that. Take a look at what he says.
Wherewith shall I come before Jehovah and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will Jehovah be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give the firstborn of my transgression for the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? He has showed thee, O man, what is good. What doth Jehovah require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God?
So you can see here, God doesn't require sacrifices at all. As I mentioned in these other videos, he doesn't care about the sacrifices. This was an old, ancient idea that was given where people would sacrifice unto their gods because cattle was so prevalent in a society as something that was more or less something that would thump your pocketbook, So if you were to get a speeding ticket in today's society, you would actually get a fine. This is the equivalent of giving something of equivalent value back in those days, that you would give up cattle because that was a big source of your capital. So you were thumping your pocketbook. It's like a fine. So don't get the idea that thinking that the blood of goats and bulls and things like that will atone for your sin. It's much different. It was just a way of thumping the pocketbook and things that would atone, just like you would atone for a speeding ticket by giving, money to the courts. It's very much the same. But that idea has been lost in translation and been twisted with the Christian doctrines and things like that have been translated and thrown around the world, and people have just lost the understanding of what the sacrifices were. But just understand that the whoring that was going on in those days is that people were mimicking the other nations' rites and doing the things that the other nations were doing by giving their children for their sin, thinking that would atone. And God's saying, look, I don't want blood. It's not blood of goats and children that I want. That's nothing close to what I want. What I want you to do is just give me a hearing ear. Just like David said, he said, listen, I delight to do thy will, thy laws within my heart. Sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, but my ear you have opened. Okay, that's Psalm chapter 40, which is something that Paul will commonly twist in Hebrews chapter 10 and say, a body that was prepared for me, as I mentioned in another video. So we've just lost the idea of what God really wants. Something that I wear on my hand, and you'll see here, is it's a bracelet, and it has etched in the bracelet, it says Shema Israel. Something that we always say is we call it the Shema. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, it says, hear, O Israel. Okay, and that's what God wants. He wants us to hear. If we're not going to hear, then we'll never be able to do. So we always have to have an open ear so that we will make sure that we are being faithful unto God and not gone a whoring. And also remember another example of gone spiritually whoring. If you remember Moab, the nation that was trying to come against Israel by hiring Balaam the prophet to curse Israel, and they couldn't do it because they were a blessed people. So they found out their weakness. And what was their weakness? Right, they went whoring after other gods. Moab found out that, hey, their strength lies in the Holy One of Israel. Their strength lies in their obedience to the God of Israel. And if we can get them to veer away from the God of Israel, then we can make them weak, and then we can capture them. And that's exactly what they tried to do. So they tried to intermingle with the people, and the men went after the women, and the women were inviting the other people of Israel into sacrifices unto the other gods. Take a look.
And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baalpor, and the anger of Jehovah was kindled against Israel.
And this is exactly what God refers to in the Torah. Moses refers to the people that we should always remember. Those that cleaved unto Jehovah were alive. Every one of those that cleaved unto Jehovah were alive that day. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2 through 4, and you'll see that God is always using that as a reminder that if we veer away by not keeping his commandments and statutes, this is equal to death. But if we cling to Jehovah and keeping his commandments, then this is life. And this is always the common thing that you're going to see that Moses tells the people throughout. Obedience is life, disobedience is death. And this is how you cling to the God of Israel, in obedience by hearing his laws. Also, if you'll remember, the leaders always had a huge burden on themselves to make sure that the people did not go a-whoring after other gods and not depart from the commandments. That was their responsibility. And so you can see that the leaders always had a huge burden on their shoulders to make sure that the people were following suit. Look in Deuteronomy 17, as I mentioned, that you'll see that he was supposed to write 2 copies for himself. Because back then, they didn't have printing presses and iPads to view the law on. Back then, they had to write it down for themselves. That was the only copy they had. So it was a big responsibility to make sure that the people did not go and spiritually go a-whoring, because the king was supposed to just be the mouthpiece of God. That's all. He's just supposed to be the word of God itself. So he's just supposed to be leading the people in to do God's commandments, and that the people would walk and not veer to the left or to the right, as it's commonly shown in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Scriptures, saying don't veer to the left, don't veer to the right, don't go whoring. These are all just terms and ways to describe the fact that God is saying he wants his people to be faithful. That's all. So here's an example of King Jehoram, the son of Asa and Jehoshaphat, and the prophet Elijah actually trying to tell him that he was causing the people to go a-whoring. Take a look.
And there came a writing to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus saith Jehovah, God of David thy father, because thou hast not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat thy father, nor in the ways of King David, nor in the ways of Asa, king of Judah, but hast walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and hast made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go a-whoring, like to the whoredoms of the house of Ahab, and hast slain thy brethren of thy father's house, which were better than thyself. Behold, with great plagues will Jehovah smite thy people, and thy children, and thy wives, and all thy goods.
So you can see that he was being rebuked because he was causing the people to go spiritually whoring away from the commandments and the laws that he gave. And the house of Israel is always one that is given as a perfect example of this. As I mentioned before, if you read 2 Kings chapter 17, you're going to see the perfect picture you see today in society, that people can claim the God of Israel but not listen to his laws and commandments, and that God constantly sent prophets to tell the people to come back to his laws, come back to my commandments, listen to me so that I would be your God and you'd be my people. But they never listened. So the house of Israel is also known today as Ephraim, or the 10 tribes of Israel that were exiled from the land due to their spiritual whoredom. And that's exactly what the book of Hosea is all about. It is about the wayward 10 tribes of Israel, known as Ephraim, departing from God's laws, in so much that God tells the prophet Hosea to go and marry a harlot, that it would be symbolic of the nation of Israel. It would be symbolic of those northern 10 tribes, that they don't listen to my law anymore. They've gone whoring after other gods. They don't listen to me. They don't realize what they're doing. And nobody's teaching them to go in the right ways. And what happens is the people end up being destroyed for a lack of knowledge, as you'll see, as I commonly quote in the book of Hosea, chapter 4, it says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, you shall be no priest to me. I will forget your children. You've forgotten my law. And so it's the responsibility upon the leaders, but I commonly mention that it's the responsibility of the pastors today that they would lead the people, as the prophets were trying to tell the people back then, to come back into God's laws and not go whoring. So the illusion is given in the prophet Hosea that he marries a harlot, and it's supposed to be symbolic of that nation. And look at some of the things that God says about the nation of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, in the book of Hosea. Take a look.
Ephraim is oppressed, he is crushed in judgment, because he was content to walk after man's command. Therefore I have hewed them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and thy judgments are as the light that goeth forth. For I desire goodness, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. But they, like Adam, have transgressed the covenant. They have dealt treacherously against me.
Now you can see today that Ephraim, the northern 10 tribes, do exactly as the churches do today. They do the exact same thing, and that's who the churches are. They are the lost 10 tribes of Israel scattered amongst the world, and they're doing the exact same things as those northern tribes have done, but God is looking for a righteous remnant that seeks him, and with their whole heart has sought after Jehovah, the God of Israel, in doing his commandments, as David said himself in Psalm 119, verse 10. You can see that God says, I'm looking for people that are going to seek me with their whole heart and do my commandments. See, the church is today not doing these commandments. They're doing their own thing. They're hearkening after their own heart, their own eyes, just as Paul even said to do. He said, just do whatever's fully right in your own mind. This is exactly what God said not to do. He said that is spiritual whoredom. And this is what you're going to see later in this video about the whore of Babylon, is the fact that they're just doing whatever they wanted to do, and they're slaying the prophets and telling everybody that's telling them to come back to the laws. They're the ones that are guilty of the blood of the prophets. And this is why God calls Ephraim a deceitful bow. They return, but not to the Most High. They hold revivals, but they never come back to God's laws. It's like their heart is not really with him. They just try to soften their heart, but they'll fix things that are morally improper. As you'll commonly see, the hot buttons are things that will set off people about homosexuality and abortion, things like that. Those things they stand for, but when it comes to God's laws, we don't want anything to do with that. That's done and gone away with. This is exactly what the book of Hosea is trying to tell the people, is that you've gone whoring. It doesn't matter. You return, but you don't come back to the Most High.
Hosea 7, verse 16, they return, but not to the Most High. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword, for the rage of their tongue, for this shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. I have written to him the great things of my law, but they were counted as a strange thing. They sacrifice flesh for the sacrifices of mine offerings, and eat it, but Jehovah accepts them not. Now will he remember their iniquity, and visit their sins, for they shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his Maker, and builds temples, and Judah has multiplied fences, but I will send a fire upon those cities, and it shall devour the palaces thereof.
And this is the idea that you get, that every house that my heavenly Father has not built shall be torn down. This is exactly what the Psalm says. Except the people build the house in the name of Jehovah, the people labor in vain. The churches today are building up these houses and building these temples, but they're not to the Most High. They are not in accordance with what God says is the backbone of knowing Him, and that is, listen to my instructions. Listen to what I'm telling you to do. And this is exactly what the Whore of Babylon is. It is not just one specific church. I commonly hear Protestants say, well, that's the Catholic Church. No, what it is, spiritual whoredom at its core, as we've seen in these videos, and as you see in this video, is veering away from what makes a person separated unto God, and that is by listening and doing His commandments, His statutes, His ordinances. And the idol that is physically placed there is that of Jesus. If you're going to a Baptist church, if you're going to a Messianic church, it doesn't matter the name of the church. If you are not keeping these commandments and doing them, and you are worshiping a man by the name of Jesus or Yeshua or any other name for that matter, then this is idolatry and spiritual whoredom combined. And you are veering people away from the God of Israel and the truth that He holds in His laws to know Him. Because if we're not doing these laws, if we're not doing these commandments, that is spiritual whoredom. We have become unfaithful. And if we're trying to teach people to go away from it, then we ourselves that are leading these people into that pit will fall ourselves into that pit itself. And just like the proverb says, a whore is a deep ditch. And if we're not going to listen to His laws, look at Proverbs chapter 28, and it says that if you won't listen to my laws, your prayer is an abomination. So why are you praying to me if you won't listen to what I tell you to do? What point is there? That's what He's trying to say. Why are you praying to me if you won't listen and do what I'm telling you to do? Why do you call out to me? I've told you what to do. So I'm hoping that these things will be a help. I'm hoping people will understand what spiritual whoredom is, and that is just veering away from God's commandments and doing the things that He says for us to do. That's how we know Him. That's how we can create a relationship with Him. You might have things that you do with friends and family that become rituals that you can identify with those people with. Well, that's what God says His Sabbath is. You know, in 7 days, in 6 days, He created heaven and earth. On the seventh day, He rested. So we do the same. We don't work. Money is not our God. We can't serve God and money at the same time.
I'm gonna need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow. So if you could be here around 9, that would be great. Okay?
Are you going to keep the Sabbath that He gave for a perpetual covenant to all generations? You know, you have to understand that God says that, you know, He will always give mercy to 1,000 generations to those that love Him and keep His commandments. But those that hate Him, He's going to repay them to His face. So if you love Him, keep His commandments. Just do what He says to do, and you'll be blessed for it. That's what the covenant is about. That's what spiritual whoredom is about, is that we go away and we worship other gods, or we just simply don't listen to His laws anymore. That's what makes a person holy unto Him. You can be righteous. You can be a kind person. You can be a moral person. But that doesn't mean you're holy unto God. That doesn't mean you're a unique people separated by the laws that He gave to follow unto Him. It means you're worshiping another God. This is spiritual whoredom. And if you are telling people not to listen to God's laws, then you're no different than those that killed the prophets before us, those that said, we don't want to listen to the prophets, because all the prophets' job was to do was to tell the people, come back to the laws, come back, be zealous, come back to the covenant that God gave us, and they ended up killing the prophets. And this is the illusion that you'll see in Revelation. They were guilty of the blood of the prophets. They've shed innocent blood, because all those that keep God's laws, God says, are righteous. Listen to me, ye that know righteousness, in whose heart is my law. Fear ye not the reproach of men, for the moth shall eat them up like a garment. That's exactly what God tells us in Isaiah chapter 51. So righteousness is by the law. That's why He gave it to us. We're supposed to be a group of people that God can call His own to show the world, hey, this is my righteousness. This is what I am. You are a representative of me by doing these commandments. And His word is not going to go forth and be null and void. He gave the covenant. He gave the law for a purpose so that we would do it and bring glory to Him. And if we're not going to do it, there's no point. We're not fulfilling our purpose as a faithful wife to Him. So again, I hope this video is a help. I know it's a little bit longer one, but I try to put as much information in this as I can and try to hit these points at all angles so people can see that, you know, the church, we got to help our friends that are in the church that are searching. If you're seeing these videos, that means you're really searching, because there's not a whole lot of people that see these videos, and it's not a lot of things that people want to hear. So again, I thank you again for watching, and I hope you spread this to people that are searching, and I'll see you again on another video.
Let there be